On a night when the storm howled like 1,000 lost souls, a lone cowboy opened his door and found a bloodied, pregnant stranger who would change the fate of the land forever. The howl of the storm outside was nothing compared to the cry that shattered it. Wind tore across the moor like the wail of ancient spirits, driving sheets of rain against the stone walls of the cottage with relentless fury. The peat fire guttered and sparked in the hearth, casting dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist in the amber light. Alastair MacKinnon, war-worn Highlander and tenant-chief of a fading clan in the outer Highlands, sat hunched over his meagre supper of oatcake and cold mutton, scarcely recognizing the frantic knock at his cottage door. The sound came again, desperate, urgent, cutting through the storm's rage like a blade through silk. For 15 seconds he hesitated, his weathered hands pausing over his wooden bowl, glancing from the flickering peat fire to the battered door that had weathered countless Highland storms. The iron hinges groaned under the wind's assault, and the ancient oak timbers creaked like the bones of some primordial beast. Summoning courage from depths he had not explored since the last clan battle, he strode across the low threshold on legs that had carried him through too many wars and his life, and the life of his quiet glen, changed forever. He closed the door gently behind him as he went to tend the fire, adding another block of peat to ward off the encroaching chill. The flames leaped higher, casting his tall frame in stark relief against the rough stone walls. Alastair held his breath as he stepped closer to the door, his bare feet silent on the cold flagstones. There in the scoured darkness beyond his threshold, a figure cowered against the fury of the Highland night. A woman, drenched in rain and blood, clasped her swollen belly with trembling hands and pressed herself against the weathered door frame. Her cloak, once fine wool, now hung in tatters about her shoulders, and her dark hair was plastered to her skull by the driving rain. Her wide eyes were wild with fear and pain, darting constantly to the horizon as if expecting pursuit. The lightning illuminated her face in stark, terrible clarity, pale as Highland mist, with the high cheekbones and proud jaw of the old bloodlines. Alastair fetched a lamp from the wooden shelf beside the hearth, its flame dancing wildly in the draught, and saw the half-recognizable face a stranger to him, but something ancient in the lines of her features spoke of noble heritage. The aristocratic tilt of her chin, even in her extremity, marked her as no common cottager's daughter. "Please," the woman gasped in Scots Gaelic, her voice tight with pain and exhaustion, the words tumbling from her lips like water over stones. "I beg you to take me in. My time has come. The child, it must be safe." She did not look around or catch his eye. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon beyond the door, searching the storm-lashed moor with desperate intensity. A distant shape moved on the heather, or was it a trick of lightning? The purple shadows seemed to shift and dance, and for a moment Alastair thought he saw riders silhouetted against the sky. Then she moaned low, pain racking her shoulders, and her knees buckled beneath her weight. "If I live not through this night, no, I will not," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm's roar. Her hands clutched at her belly as another wave of pain swept through her, and Alastair saw the dark stain spreading across her torn skirts. Time was running short, and the child within her would not wait for the storm to pass. Alastair had no time to question her presence or ponder the mystery of her noble bearing. He hoisted her within, away from the storm's bite, his strong arms supporting her slight frame as she stumbled across the threshold. Inside, the small stone cottage smelled of peat smoke and well-worn leather, of dried herbs hanging from the low rafters, and the lingering scent of his evening meal. The walls were thick enough to muffle the worst of the storm's fury, and the fire cast a warm, golden glow over the simple furnishings. Alastair's hands trembled as he led her to a wooden settle by the hearth, its surface worn smooth by generations of Highland folk who had warmed themselves before this fire. The cushions were thin and patched, but clean, and he arranged them as best he could for her comfort. "Mother, please help me," the woman cried to the empty corner of the room, as if she prayed to the very walls themselves, calling upon some presence that only she could see. Her voice carried the desperation of one who had lost everything save the life within her womb. No one answered but the wind, moaning through the chimney like the voices of the dead. Alastair knelt beside her and pulled off his wool cloak, the one his mother had woven for him before the fever took her, spreading it over the settle with gentle care. The cottage was dim, lit only by the lamp he held and the flickering fire, casting everything in shades of amber and shadow. "Breathe now," he ordered gently in the old tongue, his voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to command. I'm calling old Duncan the Howdy." The ancient midwife was the only one in the glen with the knowledge to help in such times, and Alastair prayed she would come quickly through the storm. Alastair helped her lie down on the settle, worry creasing his weathered brow as he saw how the pain consumed her. Duncan Campbell, the ancient midwife of the glen, was as weathered as the hills themselves and as steady as any steel blade drawn in battle. She had delivered half the babies in the glen and guided as many souls into the world as she had helped depart from it. If anyone could save both mother and child, it would be Duncan. Alastair had little time. Pain tore a scream from the woman's throat as he threw on his oilskin and plunged back into the storm, fighting his way up the muddy path to the kirk where Duncan kept her vigil. The rain lashed his face like needles, and the wind threatened to tear him from his feet, but he pressed on, driven by the woman's desperate need. Upon Duncan's arrival, breathless and soaked through, but carrying her worn leather satchel of herbs and remedies, the two men laid the woman across the cloak with urgency. Duncan's gnarled hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking the woman's condition with gentle but thorough care. In the flicker of lamplight, Duncan saw that the labor had begun in earnest, and there would be no turning back now. He murmured a comforting Gaelic blessing as he wetted cloths in boiling water, the ancient words flowing like honey over the woman's fevered brow. The blessing had been passed down through generations of Highland midwives, a prayer for safe passage between the worlds of the living and the yet-to-be-born. "Easy, love," he soothed, kneeling by the woman's legs with the patience of one who had seen this miracle countless times. "Let the child come as it will." By flickering lamplight and lantern glow, Alastair listened as Duncan laid out herbs and hot stones, each item placed with ritual precision on the small table beside the settle. Dried heather for blessing, smooth river stones heated in the fire for warmth, and bundles of herbs whose names were older than memory. He felt utterly powerless, dread coiling in his belly like a serpent, as Duncan prepared to aid the woman they now knew was called Rona. The pregnant woman clenched her linen shawl against the rough wood of the settle, her knuckles white with the effort of containing her cries. Pain struck her again like a lightning bolt, a howl tearing from her lips that seemed to shake the very stones of the cottage, and Duncan worked swiftly with hands that had delivered hundreds of Highland babes, his weathered face creased with concentration as he guided Rona's trembling form through the ancient dance of birth. "Here now," Duncan murmured, steadying Rona with one strong hand while preparing the final necessities with the other. The old midwife's voice carried the calm authority of one who had wrestled with death and won more often than not. Alastair found himself an odd attendant, rooted to the spot by the raw power of the moment, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird. He tightened his grip on the wooden footstool for balance as Duncan bore down, guiding the child into the world with gentle but firm hands. The lamplight seemed to pulse with each of Rona's labored breaths, and the shadows danced on the walls like spirits gathering to witness this moment of creation. In the blink of an eye and eternity folded into one, the woman's cry shifted from agony to triumph, a sound that seemed to reach back through all the generations of Highland mothers who had brought forth life in times of darkness. The newborn baby came screaming into the world, his voice strong and clear, cutting through the storm's fury like a sword through silk. He let out a cry that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cottage, a proclamation of life that defied the storm and the darkness beyond. Duncan wrapped him in a woolen shawl that had warmed Rona's shoulders, the fabric still carrying her scent, and lifted him with reverent care into Alastair's waiting arms. Alastair's eyes, wet with relief and wonder, took in the tiny red form that pulsed with new life. The baby's tiny fists clenched as if to greet the world with defiance, and his eyes, when they fluttered open, were the vivid blue of Highland sapphires. Duncan smiled beneath the gravity of the moment, her weathered face softening with joy. "He's bonny. Ah, the boys of Mackinnon, such bold lungs he has," she praised softly, her voice carrying the pride of one who had helped bring forth a new generation. "This one will be a warrior, mark my words." But even as they celebrated the child's arrival, Rona lay still upon the settle, her breathing shallow and labored. Her face, framed by damp curls of auburn hair that caught the firelight like spun copper, was almost serene in the dusty lamplight, but there was a pallor to her skin that spoke of life ebbing away like the tide. Alastair peered down at her, a sob caught in his throat as he realized what Duncan's gentle expression meant. The woman who had trusted him with her most precious burden was slipping away, her strength spent in the act of giving life. Duncan placed a weathered hand on Alastair's shoulder, her touch conveying both sorrow and acceptance. "She has gone to sleep," the midwife said quietly, using the gentle euphemism that Highland folk employed when speaking of death. Rona's breath ceased with a final, whispered sigh, leaving behind only the echo of life in her child and the memory of her desperate courage. Alastair draped his own cloak over her lifeless form as a silent sign of honor, the wool settling over her still features like a shroud of respect. They wrapped Rona's body gently in her own cloak, the fine wool now stained with the price of bringing life into the world, and propped her on the settle where she could rest in dignity. Alastair knelt at her side to search for anything that might tell him who she was, what had brought her to his door on this night of storm and sorrow. All he found was a silver brooch shaped like a thistle, its surface worn smooth by countless hands, and a folded scrap of cloth stiff with blood that bore markings he did not immediately recognize. He turned back to the child, still bundled in the woolen shawl, and felt his heart clench with a mixture of joy and sorrow. The babe's eyes, a vivid sapphire blue that seemed to hold all the depth of Highland locks, locked onto Alastair's, and he felt a strange warmth flow between them, or was it simply his own heart opening to this orphaned soul? The baby huffed out a breath and pressed close against Alastair's coarse shirt, seeking warmth and comfort in the only embrace he had ever known. Outside, the gale had quieted to a mournful whisper, as if the storm itself mourned the passing of the woman who had braved its fury to bring new life into the world. Alastair carefully lifted Rona's body onto a pallet of peat moss in the corner of the cottage, arranging her limbs with the respect due to one who had died in the sacred act of birth. He recited an old Irish prayer for those passing over the dark river, his voice joining with Duncan's in the ancient words that had comforted the dying for generations beyond count. Duncan retrieved herbs from her satchel and gently bandaged the mother's still form, murmuring farewells in the old tongue, while Alastair rocked the boy back and forth. The child seemed to sense the solemnity of the moment, his cries subsiding into soft whimpers as he nestled against his protector's chest. As dawn's first gray light stained the sky like watered ink, filtering through the small window to chase away the shadows of the night, Alastair realized with a start that something long kept dormant within him was now awakened and changed. He held what might be the future of his clan in his arms, a child whose very existence had already transformed his quiet world into something larger and more dangerous. Word of the birth and of Rona's death spread quickly throughout the glen, carried by the wind and the whispers of those who had seen Duncan hurrying through the storm. In the days that followed, Alastair fortified his home with quiet determination. He put away his few pieces of fine silver in a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, secreted extra blankets and provisions in the stone larder, and even knotted the leather-wrapped hilt of his father's claymore under his pillow where his hand could find it in the darkness. Conversations in hushed tones drifted past his door like morning mist. The child was a stranger's, after all, and in times of trouble, strangers brought danger. The Glen folk had learned to be wary of anything that might draw the attention of enemies or bring the wrath of distant lords down upon their heads. Lachlan MacKinnon, second in command of the clan, and a man whose ambitions had long been thwarted by his lack of direct bloodline, glowered often at the cottage from his position on the hill. He alone among the clan had travelled widely enough to recognize the significance of symbols and tartans, and his sharp eyes missed nothing. He alone knew the meaning of the thistle-shaped brooch that had adorned the dead woman's cloak, and his experienced gaze had recognized the distinctive pattern of the MacLeod tartan woven into the fabric of her shawl. Rumors of rebellion and forbidden unions with traditional enemies began to swirl around the glen like autumn leaves in a whirlwind. The old feuds ran deep as Highland roots, and the MacLeods had been counted among the MacKinnons' most bitter rivals for generations. What did it mean that a MacLeod woman had died giving birth in their midst? What darkness had she brought with her from across the moor? But Alastair answered all questions and suspicious glances with calm resolve that brooked no argument. To his kinsmen who dared voice their doubts, he declared with the authority of one who had led them in battle, "This boy has no other protector but me. Under heaven and before God, he is mine to protect, and I will suffer no harm to come to him." He named the infant Finlay, in memory of his own late father who had died defending the clan's ancient rights, and he spoke of the child with a fierce pride that surprised even himself. He even joked faintly, when the mood was light and the whiskey flowed freely, that Finlay's first word would surely be a war cry worthy of his Highland heritage. The clansfolk relented in part, for Alastair was trusted above all others, and the child was innocent of whatever sins might have brought his mother to their door. The baby's bright eyes and ready smile won over even the most suspicious hearts, and his lusty cries spoke of strength and health that promised a bright future. Still, Lachlan's lips twisted in contempt as he watched the unlikely father and son playing quietly in the glen, Alastair teaching the boy to grip his finger with tiny hands already showing the strength that would one day wield a sword. The sight of domestic happiness kindled something dark and envious in Lachlan's breast, and he began to plan. It was not long before Lachlan's jealousy overcame his caution, and he decided to act. One chill morning, when the mist hung low over the loch and the glen was quiet save for the distant lowing of cattle, he burst into Alastair's cottage without ceremony as Finlay was taking his morning milk from a wooden cup. Alastair stood up with swift precision, his warrior's instincts immediately alert, shielding Finlay with an outstretched arm that had turned aside many a blade in battle. The child, sensing his father's sudden tension, whimpered and pressed closer to the familiar warmth of Alastair's chest. "I need the bairn for a moment," Lachlan said bluntly, his voice carrying an edge of barely controlled menace. "It concerns clan business, and there are questions that must be answered." His eyes darted with predatory intensity to the faint red birthmark behind Finlay's ear, the same distinctive mark that Alastair had noticed on the blood-stained scrap of cloth found among Rona's belongings. "Your business is with men grown, not with babes in arms," Alastair said quietly, taking a measured step back while his free hand moved instinctively toward the dirk at his belt. His son whimpered again, small fingers clutching at his father's shirt, as if sensing the danger that hung in the air like morning mist. Lachlan's gaze hardened with the satisfaction of one who believes he holds the winning hand. "I know that mark," he hissed, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. "Your son's mother was a MacLeod, was she not? You've brought their cursed flower into our midst, and with it all the doom that follows their bloodline." Alastair's jaw tightened as he pressed Finlay closer to his chest, feeling the child's rapid heartbeat against his ribs. "Rona chose me to protect him, whether he bears MacKinnon blood or not. Any man who would harm this innocent child shall answer to me with steel and fire." The firelight from the hearth reflected off the polished steel of Alastair's sword hilt as he subtly shifted his grip, his weathered fingers finding the familiar comfort of the weapon that had served him faithfully through countless battles. The blade remained sheathed, but its presence spoke volumes about his intentions. Lachlan stammered for a moment, perhaps realizing that his accusations had pushed him closer to a confrontation than he had intended. But Alastair's eyes never left his face, and the silence stretched between them like a drawn bowstring. "Enough!" Alastair said after a long moment, his voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. With deliberate movements, he withdrew the leather satchel he always wore about his neck. "Duncan's insistence," she had said, though she had never explained why, and poured its carefully guarded contents onto the low table that stood between them. Duncan had warned him that this day might come, when questions would be asked that demanded answers written in ink rather than sworn on honor. A letter, its ink blurred by damp but still legible, tumbled out among the few coins and small treasures he kept there. The parchment was yellowed with age and folded many times, as if it had been read and reread by anxious hands. Alastair unfolded it with the care due to something precious, his fingers trembling slightly as he recognized the familiar handwriting. Time seemed to freeze as he read the words that would change everything, the silence broken only by the crackling of the fire and Finlay's soft breathing. It was written in Angus MacKinnon's own hand, the penmanship unmistakable even though dampened by time and weather. The letters were formed with the careful precision of one who had learned to write late in life, but took pride in the accomplishment. The seal at the bottom, though cracked and faded, bore the unmistakable mark of the clan chief's ring. Alastair's voice was steady as he read the crucial words aloud, each syllable falling into the silence like stones into still water. The letter spoke with stark clarity. Finlay was indeed the son of Angus MacKinnon, late chief of the clan, born of his secret union with Anna MacLeod of the northern branch, a woman whose beauty and noble heart had bridged the ancient enmity between their peoples. The child had been born in secret to protect both the bloodline and the fragile peace that Angus had been trying to negotiate between the warring clans. His mother had been given the name Rona to hide her true identity, but she was Anna MacLeod, daughter of chiefs and mother of the rightful heir to Clan MacKinnon. The room fell silent except for the gentle crackling of the fire and the distant sound of wind through the heather. Alastair's voice carried the weight of absolute truth as he proclaimed what the letter revealed. Around him, the very air seemed to shimmer with the significance of the moment, and even Lachlan's face went pale as the implications sank in. The child in Alastair's arms was not merely an orphan to be pitied or a stranger to be feared. He was the blood heir of their late chief, the rightful leader of Clan MacKinnon. The ancient parchment in Alastair's hands was proof enough for any Highland court, naming the child as Angus's own son and legitimate successor. For a long moment, it seemed as if every breath in the cottage was held, every heartbeat suspended. Then reality crashed back like a wave against the shore, and Lachlan's face contorted with rage and disbelief. "You traitor!" he spat, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying the venom of a serpent. His hand moved to his belt, drawing the curved dirk that had been his father's before him. "You've kept this secret to steal what should have been mine." But Alastair was steady as granite, his warriors calm, unshaken by the threat. With Finlay cradled safely in one arm, he blocked Lachlan's knife thrust with the crossguard of his claymore, the steel singing as it was drawn in one fluid motion. Sparks flew in the firelight as steel met steel, and the clash rang out like a bell in the confines of the cottage. "Back away," Alastair commanded, his voice carrying the ice-cold authority of one who had commanded men in battle and seen them die for honor. "Stand down, or face the consequences of drawing steel against your rightful chief." Lachlan's knuckles whitened on his blade as he pressed forward, but realization was beginning to blossom in his mind. The letter was genuine. He could see that in the careful formation of the letters, in the familiar seal that had closed countless clan proclamations. Alastair truly did hold the rightful leadership, not through conquest or acclaim, but through the sacred trust of protecting the bloodline. With a growl of frustrated rage, Lachlan threw down his dagger and fled out into the morning mist, cursing under his breath in the old tongue. He forced his face into a snarl of defiance, his jaw clenching with the bitter taste of defeat as he spat curses that would have made his ancestors blush while he slipped away into the heather. The old midwife Duncan, who had appeared at the door during the confrontation, and the handful of gathered clansmen who had heard the clash of steel, exhaled as one. The tension that had filled the cottage like smoke began to dissipate, replaced by something deeper and more lasting, the recognition of truth. Later that same night, as the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, Alastair gathered the clan by firelight in the longhouse that had sheltered their people for generations. The great hall was packed with men, women, and children, all come to witness what they sensed would be a moment of great importance. Before them all, he held Finlay on high, the child's eyes wide and unafraid as he gazed out at the sea of faces. The firelight played across his features, and more than one observer noted the strong jaw and proud bearing that marked him as true MacKinnon stock. "Hear this!" Alastair proclaimed in the old Gaelic, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "This boy is the son of Angus MacKinnon, born to protect our clan's future and carry our bloodline forward. By his father's own hand and seal, he is our rightful chief, and none shall harm him while I draw breath." Gasps and sobs filled the hall as the full significance of his words sank in. The elders nodded their grizzled heads, their eyes shining with tears of joy and pride. Here was their future, their hope made manifest in the form of a child who would grow to lead them through whatever trials lay ahead. The whispers that had followed Finlay's arrival turned from fear and suspicion to fierce loyalty and protective love. He was no longer an outsider's child to be tolerated. He was their own, their chief's son, their tomorrow made flesh. The clan would raise him and cherish him, protect him and teach him the ways of his people. Silence fell over the gathering as even the oldest grudges and deepest suspicions seemed to melt away in the face of this revelation. The child's legitimacy was beyond question, and his need for protection would unite them as nothing had since the dark days of the last clan war. Winter passed to spring in the Highland way, with sudden storms giving way to days of startling beauty. Finlay grew strong and curious under Alastair's watchful care, his bright laughter echoing through the cottage as he discovered the world around him. He toddled about on unsteady legs, chasing the chickens that pecked in the yard and kicking a leather bowl that had been fashioned by one of the clan's craftsmen. He learned to count by following the intricate patterns of the clan tartan that hung above the hearth, his small fingers tracing the lines of red and green and gold, while Alistair told him stories of the warriors who had worn those colors into battle. Most of all, Finlay followed his adoptive father everywhere, as if he sensed that the man who loved him might vanish like his birth mother had, leaving him alone in a world that could be cruel to orphans. Alistair, in turn, taught him softly by twilight about honor and courage, about the responsibility that came with noble blood and the songs that had been sung by their ancestors since time immemorial. The child was too young to understand the words, but he seemed to absorb the meaning through his very skin, his bright eyes following every gesture and expression. One crisp autumn evening, when the leaves had turned to gold and crimson, and the first frost glittered on the heather, Alistair sat by the hearth and lifted Finlay into his lap. The old Celtic oak beams creaked overhead as evening shadows grew long, and the sound of children's laughter and folk harp strains drifted from the gathering down in the stable hall, where the clansmen celebrated the barley harvest with song and story. Alistair whispered an ancient Gaelic lullaby, one that his own mother had sung to him in nights long past, as Finlay's bright eyes began to flutter with approaching sleep. He pulled a wool cloak around the child's shoulders against the growing chill, the same cloak that had once warmed his own childhood dreams. The boy's sapphire eyes looked up at him with absolute trust, and Alistair felt his heart swell with a love fiercer than any he had known. This was his son now, in every way that mattered, and he would guard him with his life. He placed a soft kiss on the crown of Finlay's head, breathing in the sweet scent of childhood innocence. "Sleep well, little chieftain," Alistair whispered, his voice carrying all the tenderness of a father's love. "Tomorrow will bring new adventures, but tonight you are safe in my arms." As the child's breathing deepened into slumber, Alistair gazed into the dying fire and smiled. For in that moment, sitting by the clanfire with his son sleeping peacefully in his arms, Alistair MacKinnon had discovered a profound truth. The boy he cradled was not merely the child of strangers brought together by fate, but the very spearhead of their people's future, the living bridge between what was and what could be. Beneath the star-scattered Highland sky, with the ancient mountains standing sentinel around their glen, Alistair swore a silent oath that Finlay would know nothing but honor and love, come what storms might rage or what enemies might threaten. The child would grow strong in the knowledge of his heritage, proud in the understanding of his destiny, and fierce in the defense of his people. Under the profound silence of the Highland night, broken only by the whisper of wind through the heather and the distant cry of a night bird, father and son slept at last. They were safe beneath the ancient stars that had watched over countless generations of Highland folk, protected by bonds stronger than blood and love deeper than the mountain lochs. With dawn's first light painting the peaks in shades of rose and gold, Alistair knew with certainty that a brighter destiny and an unshakable hope awaited their people forever. The child in his arms was their future, their redemption, their promise that the clan would endure through whatever trials lay ahead. At last, as the first birds began their morning songs and the sun crested the ancient hills, Alistair MacKinnon finally allowed himself to rest completely, his heart at peace with the knowledge that he had found his life's true purpose in protecting the Highland foundling who would one day lead them all.